Welcome to Sound and Fury. I am Eric Wilford Watson.
And I'm Hugh Frank, and you've got troubles, and I've got them too, but let's stick together and see it through, because you've got a friend in me.
I have no idea what you're talking about, but today we're going to talk about science fiction and fantasy, specifically them as genres. Now, if you go to bookstore, if you go to most streaming services, you'll see sci-fi/fantasy listed as one genre. We're going to talk about whether they really are one genre, if they mix, if they should always stay separate, what are some good examples of the mixing when they do, and just basically nerd out for a few minutes on the subject.
Cool.
Shall we begin?
I think it's safe to say that we're both fans of science fiction and fantasy.
Yes.
I probably lean a little bit more closer to sci-fi. You probably a little bit more close to fantasy.
Sweet, sweet fantasy, baby.
I'm guessing that my fantasies are things that should never be written down, but that's a whole other subject. I'll take my hands out of my pockets now. So, a little bit of history here. When I was younger, well, actually, every story I have is from when I was younger. I can't tell stories from
5 seconds ago when I was 5 seconds younger.
10 years from now.
We have that episode.
Right? No, when I was younger, really didn't like fantasy, but I loved sci-fi. I loved Asimov, I loved Star Trek, I loved Heinlein, and I wanted to read science fiction books. So I'd go to the bookstore, and they'd have sci-fi/fantasy, and that annoyed the shit out of me. Because I didn't like fantasy, I don't want to read about wizards, castles, medieval magic. I wanted to read about spaceships, technology, the future, and science.
Yes.
Those are not the same genre, but they're always lumped together, and it seems like the fantasy outweighs like the castles and shit outweighs the spaceships and shit when you go to the bookstore. Even recently, I took this photograph at Barnes & Noble.
Look at this photograph.
Every time I do, it makes me laugh. That's a terrible song.
I know.
It's awful.
Yeah.
It's truly awful.
Yeah.
Somebody played a couple of Nickelback songs over the top of each other, and it's like the same song.
I believe it.
Anyway.
I believe it, yeah.
But yeah, it's like, oh, George R. R. Martin is listed under science fiction. Well, yeah, he has actually written some sci-fi, but the bulk of his work is fantasy. Trees on the cover versus spaceships on the cover.
Gotcha.
But I won't deny that they mix well, and I think we got some examples when it does mix well.
We do.
You want to give one?
So one of my favorite role-playing games of all time is Shadowrun. It was loosely based on Cyberpunk, which was completely sci-fi, futuristic, cyberware, and people hooking themselves into computers and basically going online by doing things virtually.
Johnny Mnemonic / Neo?
Yep, exactly. And then a company called FASA came along, and they mixed in magic. So you had orcs and trolls and humans and mages all living together, and
Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
there was magic, but there was also futuristic technology. So you could literally have a guy casting fireballs, and then when he runs out of those, he shoots a laser gun. And
Good to diversify.
yeah, and it wasn't. I don't know what level of science fiction when you get into how pure it has to be to have like spaceships and stuff. It was not spacefaring. There was, I think, at the time there was maybe a space station, kind of like there is now, kind of in the story, called Zurich Orbital, where it was kind of like the Switzerland of space stations. Like they didn't, they had no ties to nobody, but bank accounts from everybody, kind of thing. And it's a really fun universe to play in. I haven't had the opportunity to roleplay in a long, long time, but anytime I've had the chance to play Shadowrun, I've always jumped at it. Perfect mix in my mind of technology, fantasy, mixing together to make. And I was very saddened to find out, because the closest thing to a Shadowrun movie that's ever existed was the Will Smith and I can't remember the title.
Oh, Bright.
Bright. And, oh, God, very close to Shadowrun. So freaking close. And I loved that movie. And, I understand why they canceled it. I really do, but it pains me that they
It was like a slap on the face.
Yeah, it hit hard. It really rocked my world.
Off camera, before we started filming, you mentioned World of Warcraft. Now, I always assumed that was just pure fantasy. I never played it. You're more of the video game guy.
Yes.
But I thought it was just, swords and magic. I kind of attributed it to sort of like a Skyrim type game.
It's a lot of each. Now, I've only been playing it a short time, since 2006.
Was that all?
Yeah. So, it's very, very, very fantasy heavy. However, there are spaceships. There are aliens that speak with Russian accents. The ultimate enemy is this evil legion that they have spaceships and shoot lasers and come across the galaxy on their spaceships and come try to kill you, and you have to strike back. And the final fight against the legion is actually on board a big spaceship.
Well, that would be a mix of sci-fi and fantasy then. I mean, if it's got magic and shit too.
It's got magic and shit. So the interesting thing is the players don't really have access to the high technology. You don't actually have a laser gun, which doesn't seem right, but whatever. It's more hardcore fantasy in that, but the storyline is very, very mixed.
The most important thing to me is the story.
Yeah.
Whatever genre it happens to be. But I think the most famous mixture of science fiction and fantasy isn't even something most people would think of as being fantasy, but it absolutely is, and that's Star Wars.
Yes, I think I've heard of it.
You may have seen one or two of the movies from here and there.
It's all true.
Star Wars, on its surface, has spaceships, lasers, battle fleets, real hardcore sci-fi stuff. The main villain's a cyborg. I mean, it's definitely science fiction.
But also space monks.
But if you didn't... You can easily describe Star Wars without mentioning science fiction stuff. Oh, it's about an ancient order of knights. They wield magical power. They are trying to take down a dark lord. They go on quests, and there's a hero who rises and becomes the most powerful being, and only he can save the realm.
His mentor is killed and comes back to him as a ghost.
It's all fantasy tropes, and the very existence of the Force makes it magical, which makes it fantasy.
Absolutely.
Except for they tried to sci-fi it up with midichlorians. But at its core, it's still fantasy. Plus, they give no thought whatsoever to the actual science of how spaceships work. They just do.
Well, they did until there was hyperspace fuel, and then there was long-distance chases where we're going to run out of fuel, and there's... Yeah, I mean, it started off pretty perfect, and then they just totally assed it up.
And then there's space fantasy, too, where it's science fiction, but it's so outlandishly inaccurate as far as its science that it just becomes fantasy by default. But the way I look at science fiction versus fantasy, there's a lot of different definitions of the genres, but for science fiction, I think it's made up shit, but you could potentially have this be reality.
Yeah.
Fantasy is absolutely not real and never could possibly be real.
Right. One of the many authors that I've read, and I can't remember who, but he was talking about the difference between fantasy and science fiction as whether or not you had to try to explain. So when you say in a fantasy novel, a guy has a magic sword, the guy has a magic sword. If you say the sword can allow the guy to fly, the sword allows the guy to fly. You don't really have to explain it. In a fantasy or in a science fiction type thing, you have to kind of explain, okay, so this guy has a sword. Well, why does he have a sword? Well, it's made out of light. Okay, well, so it's made by energy, and anyway. So there's at least an implied working knowledge of what things are. They have engine noises, and the blasters make noises, and there's different kind of organic things in the technology that even if you don't know how it works, you sense how it works because they're machines.
Like you might not know anything about cars, but you get the concept that a car works, and you kind of have the basics. It has fuel that goes forward, you push the gas pedal, it has an engine.
Right.
But you don't have to explain it to get that it works.
Right. And like
But if you're riding on a unicorn through a rainbow,
you don't really
then
have to explain.
right.
But even in just the sound effects, and to elaborate the point, your favorite scene from all the Star Wars movies, the pod race scene.
Oh yeah.
You could tell just by the engine noise. You've got Anakin Skywalker's little kind of thing just winding out that engine, and you
can hear the sound effects because it's a half hour with no music and it's boring, so you can
Exactly.
just sit there and listen to it.
Right, but then you got Sebulba with these big engines just just driving by or whatever, and you can tell that there's a difference in the engines and their performance. And all
Yeah.
that. It's just from the sound.
Yeah, and that's very science fiction.
And it's very science fiction. It's very, you don't have to explain. You can just the noise itself tells you that, this is a big freaking engine compared to these little screaming, it's like somebody pulls up in a 67 Camaro with,
Star Wars is basically fantasy wearing a science fiction costume.
Yeah, okay. All right. I won't disagree with that.
That's not a criticism. It's just, it is what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, most people think of science fiction when they think of Star Wars, but it definitely has a shitload of fantasy elements, and I think it's probably, if not the best, one of the best ways to mix the two. I would say also high up on that list is DC Comics and Marvel.
Yes.
Superhero stuff in general.
Yeah.
You got Tony Stark. You got science fiction. You got Guardians of the Galaxy. That's space travel stuff. That's science fiction.
Right.
You got Doctor Strange, who throws magic around.
Right.
In DC, you got Constantine, who throws magic around. In DC, you've got the Green Lanterns, which is sort of science fiction. Anything maybe it's a little bit closer to fantasy because it's just so outlandish, but it's supposed to be, a scientifically explainable thing. It's not actually magic.
Right.
But magic exists. So you have spaceships, technology, and magic, and wizardry, and demons and shit, all existing in one intellectual property.
Yeah.
That mixes it very well. And that's not comic book stuff is a mainstream thing. It used to be nerdy niche stuff, but now that is the mainstream.
Yeah, and in my opinion, the movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that really drove them into hardcore fantasy was not Doctor Strange, because a lot of that was it talked about other planes of existence, which actual scientists today are pondering whether or not there are other planes of existence.
Quantum theory and whatnot.
Quantum theory and stuff. So that was still mathematics. His ability to do these spells was also mathematics, and so you could almost explain away him being a wizard as basically a very, very talented mathematician. And everything else, even Thor, it was not, everything was still technology. His abilities were more or less
Yeah, he was
technology.
considered a god just because he was so much more advanced than the humans of that era.
Right. So to me, it was Black Panther. The reason being is that it's very, very high technology, incredibly science fiction, right? Because basically,
the alien shit that gave Wakanda the technology.
Yeah. I mean, it came from space, and they've got all this. What's the name of the metal? Why can't I think of it right now?
You can't kill the metal.
Unobtainium.
They've got all the So, and that allows them to have all this technology. But the one thing that sets it apart is the Black Panther goes back. He meets his father in the afterlife. And it's the first, as far as I remember, and I've watched these a lot, where they actually said, you know what? There's a spirit. There's a place you go when you die. And that is, it's the difference between religion and fantasy is whether or not you believe it, and to a matter, to a certain matter. And so they actually went into, no, there's a soul. People have souls, and this is where they go. And then later on in Moon Knight, which we love so much, the giant hippo says, or they ask, is this the afterlife? She says, this is an afterlife. So they follow it up. There's a little bit of a nod to Black Panther. So there is a place you go. That, to me, is very much fantasy, because fantasy is things like zombies and undeath and things being animated from Beyond Dead. None of that existed before in the Marvel Cinematic Universe before Black Panther. Everything was scientifically explainable up until just that point.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I barely remember Black Panther.
Oh. I just rewatched it the other day.
I'm rewatching the Marvel movies as a DC Comics fan. You can subscribe, and we're
That's easy for you to say.
We're periodically releasing those. I haven't gotten to that Black Panther quite yet, but I will.
It's quite a bit later in the phases. It's like phase 3 or something almost.
Phase 27.
Phase 27. Yeah. It's almost at the end there. Yeah.
Star Trek has always been considered pure science fiction.
Except when Spock summoned Satan.
Yes, but that was a cartoon. But they even had a scientific explanation for that.
Of course they did.
But Deep Space Nine walks the line right up to this could be fantasy.
Does a Deep Space Nine? I'll walk the line.
No, I mean Deep Space Nine. If you're not aware, I mean you never watched Deep Space Nine, did you?
I watched some of it. I didn't not watch it because I didn't like it. I was just at a phase in my life where I didn't watch much TV, and I haven't gone back to rewatch it. But I liked what I watched.
The basic premise of the show is that aliens that live in a space wormhole give people visions, and they created the whole Bajoran religion. Cisco goes to Deep Space Nine, blah, 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 stuff happens. But later in the season, they really flesh out the prophets. The Bajoran people consider them prophets. Starfleet considers them non-corporeal alien beings. But they give people visions, they manipulate time, they intervene in people's lives, they do godlike shit, and they actually exist in this. So that kind of walks up the line to fantasy, a made-up religion that people believe in that actually is a real thing, that has power.
Yeah.
They have fights where people are possessed by Pah-wraiths and they shoot magic out of their fingers, and like the good prophets shoot different colored magic out of their fingers. It's very much like a Sith Jedi battle.
Okay. So there's good prophets and bad prophets, and in between there's like a prophet margin?
Yes, and that's where the Ferengi come in.
Ah, that makes sense.
Cisco, the captain, this spoiler alert for a show that's been off the air for decades. The series ends where he like goes off with the prophets into their realm.
Oh.
And that's a very fantasy-ish thing. I mean, they have a lot of deep religious stuff and
Come
visions.
here, Commander. Come to our realm. Let me show you my Pokemon.
They go on quests to find mystical orbs in this show.
Oh, okay. The Dragon Orbs with Kryn.
It sounds very, very, very fantasy when you describe it, but it's still sci-fi. It just doesn't quite go over the line where it's magical.
Yeah.
I think it's fucking close to it as they possibly can. And I think it works.
Right. You know, another one that worked really well was X-Files.
Yes.
Until later on, and this is a lot of this involves death and afterlife. Mm-hmm. I'm realizing more and more. This was not I did not plan on having this hypothesis.
Yeah. Okay.
So every episode that I remember from the early days, so Mulder and Scully had their different point of view as to what happened. Mulder would always think it was aliens or something fantastical or whatever, and Scully would always say, no, there's a scientific.
A lot of gray area in a lot of episodes, too.
There was, and you could choose which side you wanted to believe, and it was presented so that you could believe either one and kind of, pick a side more or less or be somewhere in the middle. But then later on, Mulder died, and he spent like 9 months dead and buried, gone. And they came back to life. And then Scully was still very skeptical about all the stuff that Mulder was saying. And it's like,
after a while,
I died and came back to life. No human being has ever died and come back to life, and I did. Believe me when I tell you, this is not scientific. This is fantastic. Mm-hmm. No, Mulder, I don't believe you.
And that's when Scully changed her name to Thomas.
Thomas?
Doubting Thomas.
Oh, Doubting Thomas, yeah.
I won't believe unless I put my fingers in the side. And
all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so that's where, to me, it was not really watch-worthy anymore because Scully should have switched over to the believer side after
at that point,
literally seeing somebody die and come back to life.
Well, blessed are those that believe that have not seen, or something that I'm
something like that.
Something from a book that I'm paraphrasing badly. Yeah.
But if you've seen, you still don't believe, then there's something wrong with that. So X-Files was a really good mix of of science fiction and fantasy, because again, the fantasy was there if you wanted to believe it.
Well, isn't that special?
But yeah, as far as books though, to kind of go back to what originally started this, there are examples where science fiction and fantasy can mix and do it well, but I'm still really irked about them being lumped together. I feel like the people that run the Barnes & Noble or decide what gets lumped where, it's like, this is all the make-believe shit that no real literary person would read, so I'm just going to stick it over there.
Right.
And I kind of feel like, nobody would like, oh, the Western horror section is over there. The romance police procedurals are over there. The science fiction fantasy is over here.
Kind of like if we had a record store, there would be the metal section, and then everything else would just be in the other.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, imagine if you really loved Westerns. That was your favorite thing ever is Westerns, but they're mixed with detective novels.
Yeah.
So, well, they both often involve a sheriff, so we're just going to lump them together as the same thing.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Howdy, Sheriff. Yeah.
That's really all I have to say on the subject. It's just a little pet peeve of mine. Science fiction and fantasy are separate genres, although I kind of embrace the term speculative fiction if you want to do both.
Speculative fiction.
Because that encompasses everything.
Right.
If they were to put up a sign that says speculative fiction instead of sci-fi fantasy, because that includes the make-believe shit, the science maybe could be reality but isn't yet, all kind of like using your imagination to create a story outside of the realm of reality.
Yeah.
Which I guess is basically all fiction.
And books called speculative fiction are good, just don't go to the graphic novels of the speculum fiction.
Yes, that would be a different thing altogether.
Totally, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for watching. If you want to read a book that mixes science fiction and fantasy, I wrote one. It's called Judas Kissed. Although it doesn't have any science fiction in it whatsoever. And it's not a fantasy novel. But it's a good book.
It's got science fiction and fantasy. What are you talking about? It takes place in the future!
Oh, you'll have to read it and find out.
Yeah.
You can buy it for money on the internet.
I read it. It's good.
Well, thank you very much. Until next time, live long and prosper.
It's got to be the king.